Hello and welcome to A Tippling Philosopher, another video for you and hopefully another delightful experience on the YouTubes. I am very happy to be joined by Ben Watkins again from Real Atheology. Details in the description below. I made sure I put them in just now. He's not, unfortunately, he doesn't have video because he was worried that he would outdo me. And just he's too handsome basically for YouTube and he might break the algorithms. So we've just got his audio. And this is the next in the series, as James Appleson has said in the live chat already, arguments for not believing in leprechauns. Equally as applicable, maybe, I don't know. But we spoke sometime before. Ben, you were on previously, and we had a delightful discussion about atheism and all things like that. Welcome back, my friend.
Thank you so much for having me.
No problem at all. Just before we get on to talking atheism and discussing a little bit about, I want to talk a little bit tonight about induction, deduction, and abduction, and then talk about some arguments that might concern all of them, but particularly maybe abduction, and you can sort of get us off talking about those if that's all right. I just want to say thanks for people joining me now live and those who will watch afterwards. What have I been up to? Well, let's just have a little look and see what I've been up to. So please come and join us over at Only Sky, where I'm writing. I'm a columnist and a feature writer. What have I done today? I put up a piece about nuclear fusion energy. There you can see it. One of my contributors wrote Acts of God and the Climate Crisis, Who's Responsible? Wrote a piece recently on prayer, gambling on prayer, getting addicted to blind hope, looking at how prayer has very similar psychological aspects to it, very similar to gambling. And my last feature piece was An Ethical Maze, Designing Babies for a Greater Good. So I looked at the philosophical implications of gene editing in babies. That's a fascinating, I loved writing that. That's a proper feature article. And you know, lots of other ones about stuff. So please come and join me over at Only Sky. It'll be fantastic to see you there. I will now just share something else. But in the meantime, as I go and work out how to share something else, Ben, do you want to, well, first of all, just introduce yourself again for those who don't know you and what you do in the world of counter-apologetics before we talk about those different types of arguments?
Sure. So my name's Benjamin Blakespeed Watkins. Yes, that is my real name. Makes
Awesome.
me super easy to find on Google, which is pretty handy when you have a podcast. So I'm the host of Real Atheology, Philosophy of Religion podcast, where we explore questions in the philosophy of religion from non-theist perspectives. And so we try to engage as charitably as possible with the best literature that's available right now to hopefully give both atheist and theist resources in their journey of exploring questions in the philosophy of religion.
Nice. I'm just going to have a sip of wine because I'm a tippling philosopher and it's late at night for me. So I thought we could start off. By the way, I don't condone drinking. It's just something I like to do occasionally on a random Thursday night. So how about introducing this idea? Because I did just a off-the-cuff live stream the other day, and I think you chipped in and said, do you favour Graham Oppy's position or Paul Draper's position on how to argue for atheism? I thought this would be a great opportunity to actually investigate that a little bit. So could you let us know what a good working definition of inductive arguments are, deductive arguments, and abductive arguments?
Yeah, so I think it's easiest to start with deductive arguments because I think they're easiest to see.
Yep.
And if you've taken any sort of introductory to philosophy course at any point in your life, you're probably familiar with the various forms of deductive arguments, being modus ponens and modus tollens. And basically what it gets at is that the conjunction of two claims entail their conclusion. So the example that you often see in the literature is that all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal. And the conjunction of those two premises entail the conclusion such that if you accept both of the premises, the conclusion follows as a matter of logical necessity. You can't have these true premises and then a false conclusion. And so I think it's easiest to frame it this way to start with, because induction is kind of seen as the antithesis of this, kind of the idea that you could have two premises, but the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow as part of a matter of logic, but instead these premises support the conclusion in a probabilistic way. So you might say, you know, out of all the swans that we've ever observed, they've all been white. And so probably the next swan that we observe will also be white. And so these sorts of inferences can obviously go wrong. They can fail, because in fact, we did discover black swans in Australia. And so that would undercut that inductive inference.
Yeah,
Now,
so the inference would be a probabilistic argument. So before we get onto abduction, I just want to have a little think about these two. So the deductive argument is very much dependent upon the axioms or the opening sort of premises you use. If they are sound, and if they are, if they're sound, then the conclusion follows. As long as it's validly put together, then the conclusion follows.
correct.
I find this interesting because, you know, the other argument we talk about is the inductive argument, which is very much based on data. It's based on sense data that you see or experience, and then you're putting together a probabilistic argument broadly based on sense data. And that's kind of science takes on the kind of more inductive approach to how it works as a kind of method for delivering knowledge about the world. Now, when I was writing my book, looking at the cosmological argument, and I just want to say, just to show you what Doc's just written, which is just coming from watching William Lane Craig on Capturing Christianity. I need a sec to stretch the neck from shaking my head. I love that. But what I want to just mention with regard to William Lane Craig, and James Apperson has just said Kalam attempts but fails that. So I want to mention the Kalam, because when I wrote this book, I looked, one of the sections was looking at the form of the argument, and William Lane Craig, who uses the Kalam cosmological argument, which broadly goes something like, everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause for its existence. And Craig says, well, this is a deductive argument, and he kind of says, because it's a deductive argument, it's therefore a lot stronger. In a way, he says you can't really argue with this. So if you're happy with the premises, then it follows, you know, indubitably so, and this argument's great. And part of what I did in the beginning of that book is to say, hang on, although this is a deductive argument, and rather like the Socrates argument, it's actually dependent on inductive premises. And what this says is that, so in the Swan's argument, that's all actually, although it's a the Swan's argument is an inductive argument, which is say all swans that I've seen are white, and it follows on to say, well, therefore the next one I'm going to see is probably going to be white, right, or something like that. Whereas a deductive argument says, well, your Socrates one, can you repeat the Socrates one again, Ben?
Yeah, so the Socrates one starts with a universal premise saying that all men are mortal, and then the second premise is that Socrates is a man.
And so the straight away, before you get on to the conjunction or the conclusion, you've got this idea that all men are mortal, which is arguably inductive, which is all men that I have seen happen to be mortal, unless I'm entailing mortality in the semantic definition of the word men. And then it's saying that Socrates is a man. So again, that's inductive. That's a kind of observational thing. And the same with the Kalam cosmological argument, which is like all things, you know, everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Well, that's actually inductive. So it's like, well, I need to look at that and I need to explore that inductively. And then it's to say the universe began to exist. Well, again, that's another observational claim. And I need to look at how I understand that. So Craig says, oh, this is this great deductive argument. But actually, it's interestingly based on inductive premises. And I think that's quite an interesting observation to make. I don't know if you have anything to say about that at all.
I would only to point out also that the second premise, that the universe began to exist, is also an inductively supported premise. So he appeals to, at least in one respect, so he appeals to the findings of modern day cosmology to support that premise. Now, he uses other inductive arguments from mathematics, the impossibility of a past infinite set of events, so which you could say that those arguments entail their conclusion. But if you're just sticking to the scientific evidence, those are certainly inductive arguments. The other thing that I would want to point out is that you're only really getting half an argument that's deductive. So the conclusion of the deductive portion of the Kalam is that the universe had a cause. It doesn't tell you anything about the cause. You don't get any of the properties. You have to do more work to get from the universe has a cause to that cause is God, and then even more work to get from that cause is the God of perfect being, theism, and then even more work to get to
Christian God.
That is the God of Christianity.
Yeah.
So there's, we might be able to grant, for the sake of argument, just the form of that first stage of the argument as being, yes, that is a deductive argument, meaning that if we were to suppose the truth of those premises, it follows as a matter of logic that the conclusion would also follow. And we can suppose that for the sake of argument, but it's also important to realize, just like Jono just pointed out, that these have inductive support for them. It's not some axiom of logic that whatever begins to exist has a cause. That's something that Craig is inferring from our experience. And there are other inductive arguments that support conclusions that are incompatible with what he wants to infer from the Kalam. So to give an example, whatever begins to exist has a material cause. That principle is equally well supported inductively by our experience, as is the premise that is being used in Craig's Kalam. But that premise, if true, would block an inference to a disembodied mind such as God that created the universe, because a disembodied mind such as God wouldn't be a material cause.
Yeah. Interesting. So yeah, really good point. And I didn't want to dwell on the Kalam, although I do want to do some videos on that at some point, because obviously I wrote a book on that and I've got a lot to say about the Kalam. I just want to say before we go on, Ben, thank you so much to Chindi again. Chindi is just a legend. So I love it when you deal with logical fallacies by many apologists. Keep up the great work. Thank you so much. And if you've got any super chats, we will endeavor to answer them. But thank you so much, Chindi. You're such a great support. Fantastic. What I wanted to do, so we've talked a little bit about inductive arguments and deductive arguments, or vice versa. How about abductive arguments, Ben?
Yeah, so abductive arguments often go by another phrase, an inference to the best explanation. So induction and deduction are both kinds of inferences, and abduction, or an inference to the best explanation, is no different. However, it kind of combines the two different the deductive and inductive methods. And it's really it's a method looking for a theory. What do we mean by the best explanation? What is a best explanation? And so one of the views in the philosophy of science is that it should be understood probabilistically. And so that the best explanation is the explanation that is most probable on our total evidence. So when we look at evidence as a whole, whatever supports a hypothesis so that it is the most probable is the inference to the best explanation. And so the easiest way to explain this is kind of with a classic detective scenario, in which someone is trying to figure out who committed a crime, and they might find fingerprints on some gun. They might find that some suspect doesn't have an alibi, and that some suspect had a motive to have, killed someone else. And so that when you put all of these pieces together, the best explanation, the inference to the best explanation, is that this person did it. So how is this similar? How does this use the other tools, but keeping them distinct from the others? Well, this obviously isn't a deductive argument, because it could be true that all of those facts obtained that I just mentioned, there's fingerprints on a gun, no alibi, a motive for killing someone, it might be true that this person didn't kill him, that this suspect, that even though the evidence seems to point to them, there might be other explanations for these sets of facts. And it's going to be inductive in certain ways, but not inductive in other ways. So, like, it's not the case that we can just go and, from our previous experience of fingerprints on guns, and infer that certain people are killers, nor can we do that with the lack of an alibi or a motive. These are things that the data is not so clear that we can just, universally infer something from certain facts. We have to combine multiple different facts. And so we might be able to support a premise in a deductive argument using abductive reasoning. So we might say, if Smith has X, Y, and Z, then he is the killer of Jones. And so then our second premise might be Smith does have X, Y, and Z, where X, Y, and Z are those facts that we mentioned. And that would be the inference to the best explanation. And so if it's conceded that if X, Y, and Z are sufficient conditions for inferring that Smith killed Jones, then we can use these resources in an inference to the best explanation. We can come back to the Kalam and kind of see what Craig's doing there with some of those premises. He might say that the inference to the best explanation in an abductive argument supports this second premise that the universe began to exist. And he might do that by appealing to the deductive arguments from mathematics that he does and the inductive arguments from science to then say, look, the best explanation for all of these various facts is that the universe began to exist.
And of course, the strength of that argument would be on the probability of those premises that you start with, those kind of axioms or those assumptions you start
exactly.
with. So if you're saying, look,
yes,
there's a 90% chance that Smith, you put that 90% chance at the beginning, then your deductive argument is still only 90%. Probably true, although
correct.
It sounds odd to say that of a deductive argument, right? But then, of course, so to go back to Craig, then it's going to be how do you evaluate those probabilities, anyway? And he would evaluate them in probably very different ways to a naturalist. I talked about this with regard to miracles, is what are you bringing to the table when you are assessing data, when you're evaluating data?
Yes, it's very important what our background data is, because again, with an inference to the best explanation, we're trying to infer on our total evidence. So if you're just loading your background data with assumptions, you can, you can get almost any conclusion you want because your background data is doing all of the work for you.
So you get some atheists some atheistic philosophers who will say, I don't do deductive arguments because you can't have deductive arguments to prove that God doesn't exist, because basically people just move God around like a pea in a shell game, and you kind of say present a deductive argument and people say, well, my God's not like that, and I'm going to just argue that God is slightly different to that, and then you're trying to always, it's like whack-a-mole. It's like, okay, your God's like that. No, it's not like that. I've got in a bind over there, so I'm going to redefine God to be like this over there, and you try and whack that one, and you're forever like chasing different definitions of God. And so some atheistic philosophers don't like this enterprise of trying to disprove God. They think it's a bit futile, or for whatever reasons, would this be fair to say that some atheistic philosophers would say, right, I'm not going to go down the route of trying to deductively disprove God, but I will use abduction instead.
Yeah, so the reason that they want to say this is because one of the kind of dialectical virtues or ideals that we might say is that a really good argument appeals to premises that all parties can concede. And so if all parties can concede a premise and a form of an argument, then the conclusion is going to have some sort of support. And so that has a lot of force, and that has a lot of dialectical value to it. Whereas when you have a deductive argument, almost invariably you're going to have to appeal to a premise that not all parties can concede, that someone is going to have some principled reason for denying it. And so that seems that with a deductive argument, this is kind of, the tool that we would use if we're trying to prove some theorem in mathematics. And that just isn't the approach that we should be using when we ask big questions in the philosophy of religion. One of those reasons kind of being what you already alluded to, it can be this game of whack-a-mole, where you'd have one deductive argument that would apply to one conception of God, but all you have to do is just modify that conception of God just a little bit, and you can avoid these deductive arguments. And because they often purport to have this logical necessity, if you can deny one of the premises, even sometimes with just mere possibility, that's enough to undercut one of the premises. So instead of trying to play this game of whack-a-mole and having these really high standards for the success of an argument, philosophers of religion, certainly within the past 30 or 40 years, have turned to this abductive inference to the best explanation type argument, because it's really hard to deny any of the premises. And it's really hard to deny that these forms of argument support their conclusions, because they obviously do in a probabilistic sense, in ways, Bayesianism might be controversial, but Bayes' theorem at the heart of Bayesianism is uncontroversial. It just follows from the basic axioms of probability. And so you have the same strength as with a deductive argument, Bayes' theorem being on the same footing logically as something like a deductive argument, modus ponens or modus tollens. But even if it only supports the conclusion in a probabilistic way, that's still a really big problem. And it's going to take more than appeals to mere possibilities, to the contrary, to undercut such arguments.
So before I go on to actually discuss that image I've just put up, a good example might be something like the problem of evil, right? So this is where originally formulated as a deductive argument says that, an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God wouldn't allow unnecessary evil. There is unnecessary evil, therefore there isn't an all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful God, right? So, but then Christians or theists came back and said, actually, a God could allow, that we could imagine that there might be a reason that God could allow suffering. So therefore, this doesn't logically follow. At least it's not, open and closed. There is a gap here that we can say that there might be a reason. Conceptually, could be a reason for any amount of suffering in the world, right?
This is a great example. This is a perfect example of characterizing what I was just saying.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say. So then, what happened is atheists had to go away and go, okay, like as annoying as that is, and it doesn't seem to be intuitively very strong, because like I can see, a fawn, or I can imagine a fawn dying in a forest over a 3-day period of this horrible death. And it doesn't seem to serve any purpose. This animal dies, and yet there could be a reason for it happening. Okay, yeah, but like that just looks like a get out of jail free card. But but that fawn dying, or that tsunami killing 240,000 people, or whatever, like, what's that probably going to support? Like, is it more likely on theism with omni God, or is it more likely on atheism with no God? And then so therefore we come to this evidential problem of evil argument that says, well, actually, okay, given that there is suffering, what does it more likely support? Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, more or less. I think that is a fair assessment. I think the dialectic went more or less how you explained it, because really where it started was with J.L. Backey's Evil and Omnipotence. And so he wanted to say that, look, the propositions God exists and evil exists are positively irrational because they entail a contradiction. Well, it's not obvious how God exists and evil exists entails a contradiction. So you have to supplement it with some other premises. And so his premises were that, a holy good God eliminates evil so far as it can, and an omnipotent being can do whatever is logically possible. And so what Alvin Plantinga has famously done is try to say that, look, theists aren't committed to those two auxiliary hypotheses. There's this possibility that we have for the holy good premise that we have free will, and that free will brings with it the significant freedom, the ability to freely choose evil, and that this is a great good. And so it wouldn't be the case that a holy good being would eliminate all evil so far as it could, because some of that evil might be the result of free creatures. I mean, so that's a possibility. And
yeah, I mean, obviously that's
even if you appeal to natural, you can appeal to natural evils and say, oh well, these avoid free will, and then Plantinga's infamous move here is to say, well, those are the result of the free creatures of fallen angels and demons, and that all he needs is for this to be logically possible.
I don't think so. Actually, this is where I don't think original sin is logically possible. I think as soon as you accept that God has divine foreknowledge, it all becomes really problematic. And I've talked about this in plenty of videos, which is like, if you're going to design Adam and Eve, right, from scratch, they have absolutely no power over their existence. They didn't bring themselves into existence. God designed them, and God foreknew what they would do, and they did it anyway. And then God punishes them for doing that, but actually knew that they would and designed and created them in such a way that they would. Then God has ultimate responsibility, and original sin makes no sense. So I had it, and I know that's what Plantinga does. I just think that's an invalid move.
I'm totally with you, but so he would just say that it was supposedly these four premises that entail the contradiction, but now if we're saying all these other things that original sin is, we need more premises for that. So absolutely right, we can make more argument here. But then his other point about the omnipotence is that it might be the case that every world God creates, because he values free will, suffers from what he called trans-world depravity, and so that it might be logically possible for God to create a world where everyone freely chooses right, but that's not a feasible world, is the language he uses. And so these two possibilities are supposed to undercut, because again, if we're saying the theist has an irrational belief because it entails a logical contradiction, we have to point to four premises, at least in this argument, that a theist is committed to. And so the only thing Plantinga, according to him, that he needs to undercut this argument is the possibility that a theist isn't committed to those two auxiliary premises.
And then, the way I would approach that is, as I think we may have talked about this in the last one, I don't know, but it's the idea of Ray Bradley debated William Lane Craig, who took that feasibility approach. He took on Plantinga's argument, and they had a great debate about heaven and hell. But the idea that why don't you just create all those people that are going to freely come to love you in heaven without having to necessarily create suffering on earth? If it's unfeasible to create a world where everyone freely comes to love God and doesn't do evil, and you have this beautiful world as you apparently have in heaven, because apparently heaven people have free will, so you can do it. But if it's somehow unfeasible in the material world, then just, if you know who's going to pass the test, just create the people who are going to pass the test in heaven. Job done, no suffering. You don't look like a complete bastard. I don't know.
I'm with you. So I think most philosophers of religion, it's said, think that Alvin Plantinga has succeeded with his free will defense. But then again, most philosophers of religion are theists. So most philosophers of religion are not going to admit that their views are positively irrational, in the sense that they have a logical contradiction.
And that depends on the viability of libertarian free will anyway, which I think is fundamentally problematic. There's no philosopher who's established libertarian free will ever. adequately. So, and they've had 3,000 years to do it or longer, and they haven't done it. So, personally, I think it falls apart there. But
and so what a lot of atheologians, atheist philosophers, religion like myself, will concede this point. This, instead of trying to run a deductive argument and deal with all the quibbles about free will and about what's possible and not, given omnipotence and whatever transworld depravity is supposed to amount to, instead of going down all this other route, that's when William Rowe's argument comes in, and it's deductive, but has one of those premises. Instead of being a definitional premise, like the other premises were sort of definitional, the auxiliary ones, he gives an example of really the failure of theodicy. So he gives the example of the burning fawn in the forest fire, and it's like, the basic argument is that theism implies there are no unjustified evils. There are some unjustified evils, therefore there is no God. And so the premise, there are some unjustified evils, he supports with that thought experiment of the burning fawn in a forest fire. And really what it is it's just the failure of theodicy. There aren't, when we try to apply all the standard theodicies to this example, they fail. And so that's why you're stuck affirming this premise that, there are these unjustified evils. We can't think of any reason why. And so enter skeptical theism. Skeptical theism is the idea that, look, we shouldn't be surprised to not know the reasons why God prevents things like fawns burning in forest fires, because God's reasons are beyond our ken, is the language that they often use. So again, we instead of trying to undermine the skeptical theist case, there are people like Paul Draper who put forward these kind of abductive arguments from evil, where he takes each individual observation and then says, look, the most probable hypothesis, on our total evidence, the hypothesis becomes most probable when we take all of these considerations, is that the universe is indifferent to sentient life.
yeah,
and he compares that with the theist hypothesis. Instead of making a deductive argument against theism or an inductive argument against theism, he pits two hypotheses against one another: theism and the hypothesis of indifference, or with a little more meat on the bones, is what is often called metaphysical naturalism.
So what Draper does, I've put an image up there of 2 jars of jelly beans, and what Paul Draper does in some of his arguments is he says, right, so say the hypothesis of atheism is, say you've got a jar with loads of red beans in, right? Which is all these arguments that support atheism, that really argue for atheism. A couple of blue ones that support theism, a couple of ones that maybe you're like, oh, yeah, okay, that favors theism, but actually most of them favor atheism, and a couple of yellow ones that are neutral, right? And then on the other hand, you've got, in another kind of paradigm, you've got this jar of blue jelly beans. He says, right, all the blue jelly beans are arguments to support theism, and in that jar there's like a couple that support atheism and a couple that are neutral. So he says, like, which jar is reality? Is it the blue jar, the jar of blue jelly beans, predominantly blue jelly beans, which is your theistic state of affairs, or is it your atheistic state of affairs, which has got lots of red jelly beans in and a couple of blue ones, right? So he says, well, we don't know. But what happens is, if we keep looking at the arguments, if we keep taking these jelly beans, we don't know what jar we're taking the jelly beans out of, right? So we don't know if it's atheism or theism. But we keep taking these jelly beans out, which are individual arguments. And like, right, that jelly bean is red, 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 that jelly bean is red. Right, I've got 7 jelly beans and they're all red. Now, it could be that these are just the 7 red ones in a whole jar of blue ones, and I've just luckily got these red ones out, but actually the reality is theism. Or more probably, if I've got 7 red ones out in a row, it's more probably going to be true that I've taken these beans out of the atheism jar, which is predominantly red jelly beans. So he says that the inference to the best explanation of all these jelly beans, all these arguments about reality that are more probably support atheism, is that we're probably living in an atheistic world. Is that a fair enough like synopsis of
Absolutely.
of that
I think that's a really great illustration. It's a super useful visual too for helping to understand the probability that underlines Draper's argument, because what he's using is confirmation theory. And it's important to notice how that this method is fundamentally just immune to skeptical theism. So you could go ahead and concede that, look, we have, like, you might not know what the colors are in one of those jars, the jars that's theism. You might say, we have no idea what theism predicts as far as this observation of evil goes. But then Draper's just going to respond and say, yeah, but naturalism, or the hypothesis of indifference, does predict it. So because this hypothesis predicts it, and the theism doesn't predict it, and then he combines that with other claims about prior probability, saying that, and if it's also said that theism is not more intrinsically probable than a hypothesis of indifference, then it just follows from the confirmation theory that observation of evil favors the hypothesis of indifference or atheism rather than theism. And that's if none of the objections that Plantinga has put forward to Mackey's argument apply here. None of the objections that have been, as far as skeptical theism goes, that are put forward to Rowe's version apply to this argument. Now, so this, in my opinion, that the conversation is over at that point. We at this point, atheism is overdetermined because we have, like you said, there's so many red beans in favor. We've let the evidential chips fall, and they've fallen in favor of theism. We're still not making progress in the philosophy of religion. Why is that? And there's various different ways in which theists will respond to this, saying, look, these conclusions of Draper's are not conclusive on their own. There's this cumulative case in the background that raises the credence of theism. And so that by looking at all these things in isolation, you're not getting the full picture. This is where Oppie's method comes in, where Oppie says, okay, let's compare 2 worldviews, the worldview of naturalism and the worldview of theism. Let's look at all the things like theoretical virtues. So it's not that Oppie has come up with something novel or different than from Oppie. He's bringing in more considerations like theoretical virtues. Which one of these things minimizes the numbers of assumptions that it makes and primitive entities and principles that it appeals to, and then takes in other considerations that the theists would want to bring in, things like contingency and necessity. Is it, what if the universe was contingent, or what if it was necessary? What if God's creation was contingent or it was necessary? And then goes through to show that, look, a lot of these considerations are just a wash. They don't support either naturalism or theism. And so by the end of it, what he's done is Draper's arguments, those evidential chips that we figured out in the last move of this dialectic, still stand. There is no cumulative case that raises the credence or warrant for our belief in theism. In fact, the opposite is true. And that naturalism is the preferable explanation.
Yeah, and so last time when I did my live stream earlier in the week, and I said, you came on and said, well, would you take Oppie's view or would you take Draper's view? And I said, basically, I'll take both, which is to say that, you use these arguments in conjunction to use a term we've already used, then you are going to
Yeah.
you're going to be a force to be reckoned with. One of the things, there's a couple of comments from people who have said on the live chat what theists would do in reaction to Draper's claim, which is maybe you just think they're red, maybe they're all blue on the inside, or theists be like, but maybe it only looks like a red beam, maybe it's blue and human eyes can't see it correctly, so we need faith instead of sight. But I think what Draper does is he uses arguments that are quite difficult for theists to say. This is better supported. This is a blue beam rather than a red beam. It's quite difficult. So when I've seen in debate, he says, right, a bunch of different interesting arguments. So he talks about the confusion argument, whereas you got 42,000 different denominations of Christianity, and then you've got all these other religions, and you got most people believe, just statistically, most people believe in the wrong religion. Like if God is really interested in and these are these are non-resistant non-believers. So these are people who would, a lot of them would be happily wanting to believe in, say Christianity is the right religion, and Southern Baptist has got it just right. Like you've got Muslims who want to believe in the right God, right? So they're not like resistant to believing in God per se. They've just been confused into believing in the wrong God. Why would God? Which thesis better supports that data? Draper would say,
Yes.
it's
that observation of religious disagreement, that it seems religious beliefs are geographically and temporally predictable, whereas that's not the case with something like scientific beliefs. Scientific beliefs are relatively universal, but change through time as they make progress. Whereas religious beliefs are scattered geographically and remain kind of static through time.
Yeah, so it's this case that if God's created the world where most people are confused and don't know which God, there's a lack of clarity, then does that better support atheism or theism? And it just seems to better support what theists have to do is jump through hoops and say, well, it could be. And again, it's skeptical theism. Yeah, there could be a reason why God would create most people to go to hell or most people to not access his love when accessing his love appears to be the goal. But that would be weird, and you have to create some ad hoc reasoning as to why that would be. So really, intuitively, that supports an atheistic argument. And he goes on to say tragedies, things like things like the tsunami, 240,000 people, like they're under theism. There is no such thing as a tragedy because God knows in advance everything's going to happen, and everything happens for a reason. Every bit of evil happens for a reason. So there isn't a tragedy because it's providing a function. Right. So whether it be stubbing your toe or 240,000 people dying in a tsunami, that is not gratuitous. So tragedies, intuitively, like you would look at them and say, well, in order to support theism, you have to come up with loads of ad hoc reasoning why 240,000 people would have to die, or why stubbing my toe would have to happen, and it's not gratuitous. Whereas in atheism, we don't need to do any of that. It's just far more plausible. And so he goes through all these arguments where it's like this beam really is red. Like it's very difficult to argue that this bean is green. Like he looks at evolution, he looks at mind-body dependence. So sticking your fork into your brain is clearly going to affect your consciousness. And yet, how the souls work and all this, like on theism, this is a problem. You have mind and body are two separate things, but on the way we understand the world, that's very clearly not the case. So again, this better supports atheism and all these other things. Is there anything you want to say about what I'm saying?
So I think there are two very common responses, and I think it's interesting how they are in tension with each other. And so you've just mentioned one of them. So one of the responses is going to be to try to say, look, it's just beyond our ken. It's the skeptical theist approach that, look, we're just not in a position to know what God would want or not want given certain scenarios. But then the other most common move I see is that they will want to say that the prior probability of atheism or naturalism or the hypothesis of difference is much, 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 much lower than that of theism. Theism has a very high prior probability. And the observation that they most often appeal to for this is the fine-tuning data to say that, look, there are certain cosmological constants and initial conditions of the universe that if they had been ever so slightly different, then the universe as we know it would not have been conducive to life. No, it wouldn't have been conducive for anything at all. Either, everything would have expanded too fast to where a universe wouldn't have been formed, or it would have been much, much too hot, or it would have immediately contracted, or something of that line. And so what the observation is, though, is that these ranges of cosmological constants and values are very narrow rather than very wide. So in order to get this prior probability, you have to make a very, very crucial assumption. God wants those initial conditions and cosmological values to be narrow rather than wide. But what God wants is exactly what is being undercut by skeptical theism. We're not in a position to know what a God would want or would not want. And so we don't actually have, if you take the skeptical theist route, I don't think you have that assumption for your prior probability to say that the prior probability of atheism is very, very low.
And it's really difficult to make probabilities anyway when you don't know the frequency. So, for example, you might say, the chance of it's really improbable that you're going to win the lottery. Really improbable. It's like 1,000,000 to 1 that you're going to win the lottery. Yeah, but not if I buy 5 million tickets. Then it's almost a statistical certainty. So this is when people talk about abiogenesis and say, well, the chances of life spontaneously starting are like 1 in a billion or whatever. So it's highly
so I think
unlikely.
I also just misspoke, and I want to go just for your listeners to go back to make sure. So what I meant to say is that it's the assumption that those observations would be likely given theism. Now, one of the responses to that might be to say, oh, well, given atheism or naturalism or the hypothesis of difference, it's really super low. And again, I think this is an example of where they're loading the background data into this by saying that, look, these ranges could be something other than what they are. That's controversial. That's super, super controversial. That's not something that any atheist should concede as part of their background knowledge. It is not the case that it is a consensus view among cosmologists that those values could have been something different. Now, mathematically, we might be able to say what all kinds of initial conditions and cosmological values could have been. But there's nothing that is part of modern cosmology that requires those to be some, in the logical space of reasons, in the probability space, that we have to account for this, variation in what these ranges could be.
And just as Graham Oppie says, that if
this
you are prepared
alludes to another objection.
Sorry, yeah.
There's another objection here to the fine-tuning. It's called the normalizability problem. What exactly is this range supposed to be? Is it an infinite range that we're supposed to be considering, or is it somewhere in between? We actually don't know. And so I think it's a super huge assumption by the people who take this response route to say, look, the prior probability of atheism is much, much lower than that of theism. Now, this is not the only route that they try to take with this. Swinburne has famously said, God is a supremely simple concept, and that's why it's so much more intrinsically probable. But I don't want to get too deep in tangential topics.
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. So, I think Oppie would say that you say that God is a brute fact. Well, you can just say the universe is a brute fact in exactly the same way, or is philosophically necessary. And in that way, you could also just say, well, the constants that define this universe are brute fact. And therefore, it kind of gets around the whole probabilistic argument at all. Because if you're happy to say that your particular God is a necessary entity, then I can just as easily say this particular configuration of the universe is a brute fact necessary universe. And
brute fact or you could say that the universe is necessary because it has no further explanation because of the kind of thing that it is, or you could say it's just a brute fact that the universe exists. But the theist can make the same move too. These moves are symmetrical. The theist could say, well, God exists of metaphysical necessity. But then you can ask the question, but did God have to create? And most theists will say, no, God's perfectly free. He could have chosen not to create. So why did God create a universe? It's just a brute fact that God created a universe. There is no further explanation outside of God. So if it's not what's good for the goose is good for the gander, if both moves are available to the theist and both moves are available to the atheist, it's not at all obvious that any sort of modal considerations about the nature of the universe favor either theory.
And Doc also, I was just about to say this, but he's got in there. So the universe also, when you're talking about fine tuning, it's actually fine tuned for death. It appears to be far more fine tuned for death than it is for life. Like, there are far more planets that don't support life, and there are far more, black holes seem to be some kind of function of the universe or some kind of, part of the fabric, and they are definitely not life-giving scenarios. So, it's a real problem. But something
this is the undercutting defeater.
Yeah.
This is the undercutting defeater for the fine-tuning argument by looking at another observation. The universe is mostly hostile to life. And that's really surprising that most of it, it seems that life is something very late and very local. And that when you look at the rest of the universe, there is, and so it's, it's one of the analogies that I've heard here is that it's like designing a new, an Olympic-sized swimming pool to house a single water molecule.
Yeah.
It just doesn't, it seems super superfluous. And this makes the problem of evil worse.
Yeah, and even when you do get life, you get cancer and you get diseases, and it's just thoroughly problematic. So yeah, absolutely. And another point that I don't know if this is what you're saying about the normalization argument, but this is something I've written on before, which I've not really seen many places, but maybe this is it. And when theists talk about this universe is so complex, or life is so complex, therefore God. Effectively, I'm shortcutting.
It's a design argument, sure.
Yeah. But it's like, what's your benchmark for complexity? Because whatever you've imagined is super complex, is in terms of infinity, right, is an infinitesimally small fraction of what could be complex. Do you know what I mean? So you've arbitrarily looked at this one thing.
Yeah, so that's
really complex. But actually, there's nothing to say that is particularly complex. It might be complex to you and your brain, but actually, in this whole scheme of potential complexity, it's arguably a fractional infinitesimal.
Well, I think the plausibility.
Sorry, you broke up. You broke up there again. Can you start that again?
Yes. So the plausibility of that reasoning is driven by the idea that complexity can't come from simplicity. And it's the same plausibility that comes from life can't come from non-life. And so that first proposition that complexity and order can't come from simplicity and chaos was undercut by Darwin. Now, obviously, we can't apply Darwin's theory on these cosmological scales, but we can apply it to complex life. And so it's not the case. So if you're trying to get mileage out of the intuition that complexity can't come and order can't come from chaos and simplicity, that's false. Darwin has shown that that's false. And if we had a very good theory of abiogenesis, that would undercut the intuition that life can't come from non-life, The reason why that intuition still persists on is because we just don't have that abiogenesis theory yet.
Yeah. So just say thank you very much again to Chindi for your great generosity. If anyone's got any super chats, get them in, get some questions in. I want to return to one of Draper's argument, or not return. I want to mention one of Draper's arguments, which is something that I was thinking about today, and I don't know that I particularly thought about this, even though it's pretty obvious. Which is so Draper talks about how looking at humans as moral agents, he says that given theism, you would expect people who have the correct religion, whatever that religion might be, to be better moral agents than anyone else, right? Because they've got access to the real God's love, they've got access to the correct revelation, whatever that may be. Right. But when you look at humanity, broadly speaking, all humans are pretty much morally the same. And you could even have an argument about the more religious you are, the more morally problematic you are, or whatever. But ostensibly, it's a nice argument to say that if theism was true, you would expect the right theists to be clearly morally better. But that's not the case, and I thought it's such an obvious argument to a degree, but I don't think I've ever really thought of it in those terms before. Is there anything you have to say about that?
Yeah, so Draper calls this the meager moral fruits of theism.
Yeah.
And so this serves as an undercutting defeater as well for another argument that what might seem what I think to be the best argument for theism is the argument for moral agency, which says, look, we observe that there are moral agents. Well, naturalism doesn't have a whole lot of antecedent reason for us to expect moral agents, but theism does. Theism entails the existence of at least one moral agent, God. Now, so you might say, wow, here's a blue beam. Here's something that supports theism. But then Draper says, well, now hold on. Now, that might be a general observation that there's moral agents, but there's also more particular facts about moral agents. So given the theistic hypothesis, like you already mentioned, we would expect theists as moral agents who had a relationship with God to have at their ready an omniscient source and morally wise sage who could provide them strength to make the moral decisions that they need to. And if they had doubts about what the right course of action was and what was the wrong course of action, they could turn to their religion and get substantive advice from it. And so we would expect, given theism, for moral agents to live morally better lives on the whole than atheists or other non-theists in general. But that's not the case. It doesn't seem like theists lead morally better lives than anyone else. And so that's what he means by the meager moral fruits of atheism. So while it might be conceded that this general observation favors theism over naturalism, there's more particular facts about that observation that favor naturalism over theism.
And again, it's this abduction, it's the inference to the best explanation. So given what we see, what does this best support? Does it best support, and it's quite similar to the confusion and the all the different sort of denominations of Christianity. It's it's a moral confusion as well as a kind of epistemological.
So remember, the best explanation is the one that's most probable on our total evidence. So that's why this meager moral fruits observation is so important, because he calls it the fallacy of understated evidence. If you just state the fact that there are moral agents and that this fact favors theism over naturalism, you haven't stated all of the evidence. You've understated the relevant evidence for this observation given these two competing hypotheses. And so he gives a name to the mistake that's being made here.
Yeah, a couple of other arguments he talks about. So he talks about the evolution. scenario. Now I know that theists can deny evolution, but they'd be pretty stupid to do so. In my book, it's fairly obvious, and what you have to do is jump through kind of psychological. You have to do psychological gerrymandering and mental contortions in order to deny evolution.
And there might be quibbles about mechanisms and whatnot, but
yeah.
the observation that we have descended from bacteria over millions of years of biological evolution is, it's uncontroversial in the sciences. And it's one of those things that it's probably one of the greatest insights that humans have ever been able to figure out. Like the fact that we were able to figure all this out, and that we have all the support that we do, and we can explain as much as we do with this theory is pretty impressive.
I just wrote a piece it's not out yet, but it's due to go out in a couple of days. It's based on a press release from the University of Haifa, where they've just done some experimentation in Africa. Some Ghanese and Israeli scientists have done an experiment that seems to show that it might actually be directionality to evolution, which is really fascinating. So in the 1800s, you had this Lamarckism, which is the idea that giraffes grew longer necks because each successive generation was stretching higher, and that kind of they could pass that heritability on through what they did in their lives, if you like, and these were living evolutionary pressures that made their necks grow longer, type thing. And then that was kind of shown to not be the case with understanding of genetics in the 1930s.
Genetics was a huge revelation for us. It's denying evolution was far easier before genetics.
And so what happened is this kind of idea that you could direct genetic. So we then sort of then settled on evolution by natural selection being the largest of the mechanisms. There's something called genetic drift and other things, but this is kind of the idea that you have to wait for random mutations, and the good mutations, the beneficial ones, would be selected in. So that neck growing longer and longer and longer would have to take place over huge amounts of generations, because it relies on successive genetic mutations to get selected in. But it's not blind forces, because actually it's the environment that shapes the evolution. So, but this new piece of evidence.
So it's random genetic. So a lot of people like to try to strawman evolution by talking about randomness. The only thing that's random is the genetic variation. How selection pressures select for genes in a population is very much non-random. That's why we observe what we do in the ways we do.
Exactly. But now we have things like epigenetics, which is how your genes express themselves, the proteins that are involved in that, and they can be the epigenetics can be passed on through generations. So that's interesting. So it's not quite Lamarckism, but it's this idea that there can be environmental pressures that change behaviors and traits in how genes express. But this latest piece of data seems to show that and they were doing it on malaria and susceptibility to malaria, and it seemed that people born in Africa in certain areas would actually be selecting in these things more. There seems to be some element of Lamarckism and the directionality that might actually be entailed in evolution after all, and that could really shake up evolution. And you might think, evolution by natural selection isn't the only show in town, therefore theism, but you'd be completely wrong. It's just like, in fact, this may favor evolution, naturalistic evolution far more, because if you had some kind of directionality, you'd be cutting the time frame down by not having to wait for random mutations to happen in the genetic code. But anyway, it's just really interesting. I thought I'd throw that in, a bit of science, not particularly to do with this argument, but this is to say that evolution does that in general. If you accept evolution, is this a red bean or a blue bean?
I think it's straightforwardly a red bean, favoring naturalism. Why do I think that? Because I think special creation would have been a blue bean for theism. So I think if we're just letting evidential chips fall where we may, theism predicts a minded process like special creation, whereas naturalism predicts a mindless process like random mutation and natural selection. So if we observe
we
special
know that
creation,
we know you're absolutely right, because theists argue so vehemently against evolution. So we know it's a red bean because theists are so pissed off about evolution that they would try and deny it. So
well, I think it's a very natural intuition to see the reasoning that I'm laying out right now, in that no, if God wanted to create and he wanted to create a perfect creation, he wouldn't use a cruel and efficient process like biological evolution. He would use a minded process to get exactly what he wanted directly, like special creation. And again, if we didn't observe what we did in the fossil record, if new species just sprung into being, and that's what our evidence supported, theists would be saying, look, this is evidence for theism over naturalism, and that would probably be a very powerful argument. But this is just not the way the chips fell. What we actually observe is biological evolution, and observing biological evolution, you have to ask, is this an intelligently designed process, or is this a mindless chance process? And I think when you look at the data across a wide range of data, they all converge on the same answer, that this is a mindless chance process.
yeah, and I absolutely agree. And what he then goes on with, another one of his red bean arguments, is to say, right, okay, given evolution, so just a few more arguments like this, and then we start sort of drawing it to a close. I want to mention a couple more things, but what he does is he says, right, given evolution, now let's look at pain and pleasure, and
in their biological role.
Yes, so it says that pain and pleasure are, biological. They are functional. They are functional for humans in terms of our biology and
survival
in terms
and reproduction. Pain and pleasure are aimed, quote unquote, at survival and reproduction, not at moral growth, not at any other morally relevant feature. Survival and reproduction.
So they are systematically correlated with evolutionary
and that's
goals.
surprising.
Yeah. So again, it's
rather than moral goals.
Yeah. So pain and pleasure as a bean. What color does it look like? Very much like a red bean, because actually, if the correlation of pain and pleasure with evolutionary systematic correlation with evolutionary goals very much looks like it's a red bean, because it's a hell of a coincidence for God to create pain and pleasure, where pain and pleasure can be things that might exist contrary to moral intuition or moral laws, specifically religious moral laws, where you might get pleasure out of something that is biblically morally bad.
Yeah,
right.
to come back to the fine-tuning argument, we would expect pain and pleasure to be fine-tuned to things like moral virtues. So if we were to act wrongly, we would expect for that to be painful. And if we acted righteously, we would expect that to feel pleasurable. That's how we would expect them to be fine-tuned.
Absolutely. I mean, I really love some of Draper's arguments, because they are so yeah, absolutely. When you it's when you do,
he cares about the range of initial conditions and cosmological constants. He cares about the range of that for some reason, but doesn't seem to really care about how pain and pleasure systematically function in the world.
Yeah, God. Yeah, exactly. And it's looking at each of these arguments, say, is this more likely on theism than atheism? I don't think that happens enough, or enough in the arguments that we get involved in. But it's like, come on, so pain and pleasure is a really interesting one, because, as you say, it doesn't seem to be correlated with spiritual growth, with moral and intellectual development, with human fulfillment, with punishing evil. You know, it seems
finding meaning.
Yeah. And you know, there you go. So it's better explained on naturalism. And it just so happens, you know, isn't it weird that God would have created pain and pleasure to just so happen to correlate exactly with evolutionary pressures and goals
that we would predict given a mindless chance process.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, you know, fossils is what we predict on atheism or naturalism. So theists have to say things like, "Oh, Satan."
Well, the order of fossils,
planted
how
them.
we observe the fossil record, we see, you know, very, very simple organisms at the bottom of the fossil record, and as we move up in the fossil record, it increases in complexity. That's what would have to be the case if it was a mindless chance process.
You know, finding a rabbit in the Cambrian, you know, strata is, yeah. So, you know, it's very particular.
That would pretty well refute the theory at
It'll
hand.
falsify evolution. Yeah. So what we've done tonight is looked through a bunch of abducted arguments to say these clearly support, in our opinion, atheism. And in order for them to support theism, which they could do conceptually, but you have to jump through hoops. You have to come up with completely ad hoc nuts arguments as to why God would begin to do this, which, as you said, is going kind of against skeptical theism anyway, which is like, oh, I don't really know God, you know, I don't know mind of God. But that's not even to look at things like the kind of data points of, say, the Bible as a tool of revelation, you know, and to look at, say, the contradictions of the Bible. It's not even to look at issues with the incoherence of omni-God. And all it's just actually when you start seeing the whole cumulative case of all arguments, to me, I said this in my live stream earlier this week, is like I've got to the point where I just can't believe that people are still, I can because it's all about psychology, but I can't believe that people still believe in God, because the cumulative case for me is so overwhelmingly obvious that God doesn't exist.
I'm kind of right there with you in the sense. So this is where I disagree with my agnostic peers. I don't get me wrong. I understand a lot of the arguments for agnosticism, and I see why it is a desirable position to hold. But I think that if we're familiar with the facts as they are in, you know, the contemporary sciences and humanities, and we let evidential chips fall where they may, and just dispense with burdens of proof and all that, and just let the chips fall where they may, it seems to me that they just overwhelmingly fall in favor of atheism, and that's not surprising.
Well, given atheism, well, I don't know if that's a bit circular. I don't know what do you mean by it's not surprising.
Well, so there's also this question. So questions of God existence is kind of binary. There's either atheism or theism. So one of these views is going to be systematically mistaken. That's just the logic of the question as we've asked it. And so you would expect for one of these views, for beings to just fall overwhelmingly in one side with maybe a couple in the other. You know what I mean? It's not going to be this fence sitting thing where it's like, okay, I've got 5 beings in this camp and I've got 5 beings in this camp. And it just doesn't seem determinate. We already know that that's likely not going to be the way that this is going to turn out, because there's only 2 answers here. It's either theism is true or either atheism is true.
And it turns out, I've checked, it turns out it's atheism. So that's good. Just to sort of finish off, is it Nagel that sort of just mentioned something about negative theology? Do you want to take that on? What is negative theology, or do you want me to?
Negative theology.
So it only tells
familiar,
you what.
So I'm familiar with Thomas Nagel.
Yeah, so I think it's the idea that. Yeah, it's the idea that negative theology only tells you what God isn't. So supernatural is like not natural, and spaceless is not having space, and timeless is not having time. So if God, I think it's Nagel that said, if God is described entirely in these negative ways, then it's impossible to distinguish him from non-existence. And it's this idea that
he might have said something similar to that. The idea of negative theology comes from classical thinker Maimonides. And so in the medieval period, when they thought of God in these negative terms, it's because there was this idea of, can we use univocal language to describe him, or can we use equivocal language to describe him? Can we use language like we would use for us, or could we use, is it something different? Is it something completely from out of our experience? And so that was kind of, Aquinas famously tried to bridge the middle of this problem by saying, look, we can, the doctrine of analogy, we can talk about God analogously. Well, what Maimonides was trying to say is like, look, the kind of language we can use for him is from our experience, but because God is so far beyond us, all we can say about him is what he's not. And so, if you were trying to describe a boat, eventually, you might say, well, it's not something that drives around on the land, and it's not something that so-and-so, so-and-so, and it's not something that so-and-so, and eventually you get to describing a boat. And so that was how he was trying to. So, but you're right. It's such a view. There is no substance to this view. By just saying what something is not, you're not attributing any positive properties or qualities or features to this thing in a way that becomes intelligible. Because even when we do this in other areas, like in science, like we might say, there's nothing cold. Like we can only describe cold in negative terms about things that are not there. But keep in mind, we have to say something else positive. What heat is, molecular kinetic energy. Like we're saying coldness is not something because there is this other substantive thing. There isn't this other substantive thing that we're able to characterize when we're talking about God. We're just saying he's just not this, and he's just not this, and he's just not this. But you never actually get any content.
Yeah. So I thought that's just something else. I mean, we talk about these abductive arguments, and then they're all I mean, it's just a whole plethora of everything. I've spent so long arguing about like historical evidence, like the nativity and the resurrection, and how the biblical accounts are so. Oops, that's what happens when you can't feel your hands and fingers; things fall out of your hands. So I've spent so long sort of looking at the details of the Bible and how I find them thoroughly problematic. It's just like every area you look at theism, particularly in my case, Christian theism, you look at these things, they're just like, no. There's not one argument, there's not one area where I'm like, oh, that's really difficult, or I'm not sure about that. It's just like, every bean is a red bean, every bean. And even when you look at things like, and this relates back to the Cosmological Argument, so again, everyone should get the book, Did God Create the Universe from Nothing, where talking about in there, like the idea, and just one of the last points to make before we close up, like the idea of God creating the universe, right? And first of all, having personhood, if you don't have time, so if you haven't created space-time, you don't have time. So if God's existing atemporally, God is existing literally in just one instance. There's no movement of time. There's no change. God is just one immutable instant of being. You can't think, you can't deliberate, you can't make a decision. A decision is something you do. You go, oh, let's think about this, think about that. Deliberate, which is talking about time and thinking, and then thought in general is temporal. And then saying, right, I'm going to go for this. You can't do that. So God couldn't choose to create the universe. It's just an instant outpouring.
Causation seems to be in time as well. All of our
and this is what So this is what I was coming on to, which is that causation requires time, so you can't cause the universe to exist because if time doesn't exist. Do you want to have a little word about that?
I guess I'll keep it super brief. Like you've said before, it requires these ad hoc moves, and so I think one of those ad hoc moves here is to this idea of a metaphysical time, a time outside of our local space time. I've not been able to make much sense of this idea myself, and I don't find it, at least as far as I've searched in the literature on cosmology, and it just feels like an ad hoc move. And this was Hawkins' objection to these types of arguments, is he was like, look, God couldn't have created the universe because there was no time for him to create it, and to ask what was before the Big Bang is to kind of like asking what's north of the North Pole. Like, it's just our concept is broken down. We don't actually know what's going on, and that the singularity isn't an actual entity thing that we're postulating. It's kind of a placeholder for, we don't really know what's going on here, because our ability to describe the early universe classically just breaks down. Like, just like our compass breaks down north of the North Pole.
So we talk about like a ball falling onto a cushion, right? The dent in the cushion is caused by the ball falling, and because that requires time and change, and this happening and this happening and this happening, blah blah blah. William Lane Craig, for example, tries to get around this by saying there's simultaneous causation. So the causation that actually happens, there's simultaneity, and then that brings about a whole heap of problems, which I, fully disagree with, which I go into in the book. But yeah, it seems, as you say, these ad hoc kind of arguments to try and get out of a hole, which I don't think you can do. I think, causation requires time, and if time doesn't exist, you don't get causation, which means God can't cause the universe to come into existence.
It's why numbers can't cause anything.
Yeah. Abstract. One of the definitions of one of the
abstract objects are not in time and space.
Yeah. So one of the arguments about abstract objects is, one of the claims is that the properties of abstracta are that they are inert. They are causally inert, which means an abstract thing can't cause something to happen, which is very interesting. But that's a whole other rabbit hole. Just to finish off, Dustin Ellaby has said this, which is quite interesting. So thinking about red pills, atheism, blue pills, theism, not pills. Good. I'm thinking Matrix. Red beans and blue beans. In your opinion, what is more powerful on the Christian worldview, free will or love? So, free will, is that a red bean, blue bean? Love, red bean, blue bean.
So I would say, so it depends. Free will is one of those things. It depends. What do we mean by free will?
Yeah, because I say it doesn't exist.
I would say prima facie. Yeah, both. If we're talking about contra-causal free will, sure, I'll give that as a blue bean to theism, and then just deny the observation. Just say, I don't actually think that's.
I don't even know that I would give it on. If contra-causal free will, if you can make sense of that, which you can't, because your contra-cause is against causality. It's like it literally can't make sense. But if it did make sense,
I'm with you.
I don't know that I think it's a yellow bean. I think you would need it. So the thing is, you need it for judgmental God, right? But I don't think
so. I could also see it as part of the moral agency. Like, if libertarian free will is a necessary condition for moral responsibility, and moral responsibility is being used as the datum.
Yeah,
I'll give it to the theist in the hypothetical space, but then just deny that libertarian free will is a necessary condition for moral responsibility, and give a compatibilist conception of it.
You could also argue that it could fit into evolution as well, because you say that free will is important. So I argue in my first book I wrote on free will, which I need to rewrite because I didn't write it very well, I don't think, as in like my physical writing, not physical, but my writing is better now. But my first book on free will is I do posit a little idea in there that even though it's an illusion, like it's arguably a useful illusion for evolutionary reasons. Like if I say you gave me a present, right, or you did something nice for me, you put horseshoes on my horse, then I am saying that you did that freely, which means I'm going to attribute to you kind of the moral responsibility for doing that. And therefore, I will thank you for it by giving you 2 bushels of hay. In other words, that free will could, or the illusion of free will is functionally beneficial or useful or adaptive. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, you could argue that libertarian free will as an actual thing might have functional evolutionary benefit.
So for the sake of this question, because free will is such a controversial datum, I would say that love would be the thing that would be more powerful, quote unquote, on the Christian view, because the Christian can at least say, look, Christian theism predicts that we would observe loving relationships because God is love, or something along those lines. But again, I'll come back to Draper's fallacy of understated evidence here and say, but that's not the whole story. The only loving relationships that we observe are via embodied agents that have brains, whose minds necessarily seem to depend on brains. That's something that's more expected on naturalism than theism. But for the sake of this question, I'll say that love is more powerful than free will, just because free will is such a controversial data. Like if your argument is starting from the observation of free will, you're on super shaky ground there.
There are two things I say about love. One is you can argue for love in evolutionary terms. So someone like Steven Pinker, I've got his book up there, How the Mind Works, and evolutionary psychologists will look at things like love, laughter, happiness, music, all these things, and say they've evolved because they provide benefit. So you can look at the biological underpinnings of love. Yes, it's this and I'm being a bit reductive here and maybe controversial, and I would never say this to my partner, but you can argue that love is actually got biological underpinnings and is our subjective interpretation of things that are very useful for a social species to have. And you could also say, which is possibly what you were saying before, that it's yes, you can argue about love, but then actually there's an awful lot of unlove going on, and there's an awful lot of distorted love, and that's really problematic on theism. So even if you are arguing theism is a blue bean, actually, is there enough love, is there unlove, and is there distorted love, and it all gets thoroughly problematic, which then supports the red bean thesis.
So you're going to have a problem of hate here.
That's it. I was trying
God, if you're going to say God is love, God would want there to be loving relationships. Okay, well, now you've got something analogous to the problem of evil here. Why is there so much hate in the world?
Exactly. Brilliant. Okay, well, look, Ben, it's really great. If anyone's got any last second super chats or questions or anything, please get them in. But thank you. That was really interesting. I was wondering whether at some point in the future, I know this is a little bit last minute, but it's because my diary's just got all shifted around. But I wonder if at some point you want to have a chat about the Kalam. I don't know. Is that something that interests you?
I would actually very much love to do that, because I have a whole presentation that I prepared for a debate with Neil Maiman on the Kalam Cosmological Argument, but unfortunately, because of scheduling conflicts, he had to cancel. So I have this whole
that's amazing. Do you want to give the presentation? Do you want to give it?
I would love to, because I'd love to put that to use.
Damn straight. Let's do that. That's brilliant. Let's do a Kalam. I've just been challenged again. I know you did this some time back, but there's a Christian here, the Gospel Fire or something. I forget what he's called. Your Way or Yahweh Tested by Fire. He challenged me to accept a debate, and I said, I'll debate you sometime, but I've got such a massive schedule that's so busy that it's actually really difficult. And with people in America, it's really difficult for me to find the right times and whatnot. So there you go.
Sure.
Thank you to Dustin. What a show. Big love. Thank you. That's really, really generous. And Doc, who is also a fantastic supporter. I've successfully finished my bottle before your single glass. Cheers. I love your channel. Thanks, Doc. It's really kind.
I like that, dude.
You know what? I when I drink with my partner, she drinks really quickly. Not a lot, but when she does have a glass of wine, it goes down, and I'm like, I'm either really intently watching TV or too busy talking bollocks to actually imbibe. So yeah, sorry, Doc. I failed. You won that one. But thank you so much, Doc. That's really, really kind. And Dustin as well. Very generous, everybody. But yeah, I'm up for debating Christians. It's just, honestly, it's not like I run away from anything. I used to say this on my blog when if I forget to answer like big criticisms of my work, it's not because I'm ever scared or like worried or can't answer it, because I wouldn't sleep at night to think that there isn't a brick that's solid in my worldview. So if you've got a criticism of what I say, like, I want to hear it because I want to sound it out, because I want to test whether I really do have a solid brick wall in my belief system. And I would never shy away from that being challenged. So I'm up for a debate. It's just logistics. But yeah, thank you, Ben. Is there any sort of final words you want to say?
I don't have anything prepared, but I would just say I would just plug my own channel. Check us out at Real Atheology, a Philosophy of Religion podcast. We have a Facebook, we have an Instagram, we have a Twitter. We're on YouTube, we're on, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, wherever you like to listen to your podcasts, we're there.
Yeah, and Real Atheology, yeah, check it out. And he's active on Twitter and active all over. So yeah, please support Real Atheology. It's really, really important. Ben's a great guy, and his team there do good stuff. So thanks, Ben. Thanks so much for coming along. Fairly short notice, very short notice, really. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this. Thank you for your love. Thank you for your support. And thank you for basically turning up and being interested in what we have to say. As ever, question everything, particularly yourselves, and question what we say. If you disagree, then, let us know how and why we're wrong. But I'm fairly sure that we're not wrong. I checked online earlier, and I'm pretty sure that we're not wrong. So yeah,
the internet said so.
Yeah, I googled it, and I said, I googled, am I right? And it said yes, definitely right. So happy days. So thanks, guys. Take care. And maybe one day, Dustin, you guys need to make a podcast called John, Ben, and Beer. Definitely. And Ben is great. Thanks for this live stream. So you're appreciated, Ben. I appreciate you. Thanks, everybody. Take care. All the very best.